guys, so in this lesson I'm going to be discussing symmetrical scales, or also known as ambiguous scales. Now they're scales that don't quite fit into any specific key. For example, the chromatic scale. What key is the chromatic scale in? That was a rhetorical question, no need to answer it in the comments. Now, I explained in my video on cycled patterns that there are two ways to think about music, or structuring music. And that is to think about it in terms of chords, scales, and keys. That is, you have a certain chord progression which fit into a certain key, and you use the scale from that key to improvise over the top. Or you can think about structuring music in terms of patterns. So forget about what chords you're playing, forget about what key you're in, and instead I'm just going to play a simple pattern of just going up in minor thirds. So musicians label that a diminished scale, or a diminished arpeggio, but I'm asking you not to think about it that way. For the moment, I want you to think about it not in terms of, oh yes, that's a diminished scale, but in terms of, oh yes, he's just going up in fixed intervals, in intervals of minor thirds, or he's going up in fixed intervals of major thirds, or he's going up in fixed intervals of perfect fourths. And so this is where the idea of symmetrical scales comes in, like the chromatic scale. They're scales that are symmetrical. They're the same going up as they are going down. The chromatic scale, you go up in all semitones, and you go down in all semitones. The other main ones that are used in jazz are the whole tone scale, so moving up in whole tones, and then coming back down in whole tones. Right? It's symmetrical. And the fact that they're symmetrical means that they're ambiguous. They don't really have a key. Now there are heaps of these types of scales, and I've sort of just listed a few of them in the picture-in-picture here, but I should finish. The main ones used in jazz improvisation are the chromatic, the whole tone, which I just played, the dominant diminished scale, which goes semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, and the diminished scale, which is effectively the inverse of that, and goes tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone. And then there are a couple others which I've put up here, like the augmented scale and the tritone scale and the two semitone tritone scale, which aren't really used a hell of a lot, but you can sort of have a look at them just here and play around with them if you like. Now, again, if you've seen my video on cycled patterns, I explained that you can use cycled patterns to build tension in your improvisation and then resolve that tension coming back into a chord tone or a guide tone, or just into playing inside the scale again. Now, the fact that these scales are symmetrical also means that they're ambiguous. That is, they don't really have a key that they fit into. So, for example, again, the chromatic scale is not really in any specific key. Like, you can't say that the chromatic scale is in C major. That doesn't really make sense because you're using every single note. Now, of course, you can sort of fit these symmetrical scales into certain keys and chords. Like, for example, if we play the whole tone scale from C, we have C, D, E, G flat, A flat, B flat, C. Now notice that we've got the C, the E, and the B flat. That indicates that it's a dominant 7 scale or sound, or at least it's a scale that you can use over a dominant 7 chord. So over a C7, you can use a whole tone scale because it's got those two key guide tones, as well as a couple sort of altered accidentals or extensions. Similarly, the dominant diminished scale is also technically in a dominant key because you've got the semitone, tone, semitone, you've got the E there, then tone, semitone, tone, semitone, and the B flat tone. So you've got the E and the B flat in that scale, so again it fits over a C7 nicely. And the diminished scale fits quite nicely over a diminished chord. Similarly, the augmented scale fits quite nicely over an augmented chord. Now again, if you've watched my video on cycled patterns, I explained that you can use cycled patterns to build tension in your improvisation and then resolve that tension. Now you can use symmetrical or ambiguous scales in the same way. So that is, the reason that cycled patterns work is because you're playing the same pattern up at fixed intervals, so you're creating sort of a symmetrical pattern. Similarly, symmetrical scales can be used to build tension and work over any chord progression in any key, because you're not really playing in a key per se, you're playing a symmetrical pattern. It just so happens that the symmetrical pattern you're playing happens to be a scale. So if, again, we just take a simple 2-5-1 in the key of C major, you can do something like, right, so I played a little arpeggio, then a chromatic scale, and then a little phrase back down. Right, so by including the little chromatic run there, you've made the whole thing sound a bit more interesting. You've used some outside notes, but you've resolved it well. And it just sounds a bit more sort of, there's a bit more going on, and it's just a little bit more interesting. You can use the whole tone scale in the same way. Right, that was a little G whole tone scale. Right, so you can use the dominant diminished or the diminished scale in the same way. And just like when you're using cycled patterns, you don't want to just use symmetrical scales when you're improvising, because it sounds a little bit mechanical and a little bit artificial. You want to put in a nice phrase. Then a little chromatic or like a symmetrical scale, and then another nice phrase. So you mix and match them. You don't want to just be doing. Right, that actually sounded a little bit like Flight of the Bumblebee, so it wasn't terrible. But as a general rule, you want to avoid staying on the same symmetrical scale all the time. You can switch between symmetrical scales. You can go from chromatic to whole tone to augmented to tritone to diminished scale, fine. But at some stage, you also want to put in a nice melodic phrase to sound like you actually know what you're doing and have some kind of reference or bass. Right, so there I did something like a little phrase, a little chromatic run, a little phrase again, then a little whole tone run, then a little chromatic run, and then a little arpeggio down to the C to finish it off. Cool, so you can use symmetrical scales or ambiguous scales in this way to sort of create a little bit of tension, and then just make sure you resolve that tension back by either landing on a guide tone or at least a chord tone, or even like finishing on a nice chord like a C6-9. And I should say that the best way to kind of resolve it is to finish your little symmetrical scale run quite close to the note you're going to resolve to. So you don't want to be doing something like... Right, I did a whole tone scale run, finishing on the C, and then I tried to resolve to the E. And that sounded really weird because it was a huge jump. It would have been better if I did... and resolved it to the 9th, so that we've got a C9 sound. And that way I've only moved a tone rather than a 6th. Right, so I did a little arpeggio, then I did a chromatic run, and I finished on the F, and I resolved it one semitone to a guide tone on the E. Again, you don't want to be jumping around too much. Right, so that sounded a bit weird because even though I resolved it to a 5th, the fact that I had to jump more than an octave to get there just sounded a bit strange and a bit off. So really you want to sort of finish your little symmetrical scale run somewhere that's quite convenient and quite close to the note you want to resolve it to. So in a way, it's kind of like using passing notes and targeting notes. All these ideas are really interchangeable. In the same way that cycled patterns, you can think about that as a passing note to a target note, passing note to a target note, passing note to a target note, and so on. In the same way that you can think of this chromatic run as a whole bunch of passing notes to get us to our target note, which is the E here, the guide tone. So again, all these ideas are interchangeable and there's no really fixed boundaries around them. You can think about the same thing in multiple different ways. So think about it whichever way makes the most sense to you. All I'm trying to do is sort of give you a few ideas about how to think about these things. Whether you use them and how you think about them in reality when you're soloing or practicing is completely up to you. Cool, so that's all I wanted to cover. Thanks for watching. Again, feel free to leave any comments or questions. See you guys.